"You're James Wilson?" Frank Pierce's face paled, eyes darting nervously. "This won't work. You didn't mention that you were so old." The 68-year-old veteran stood rigid, his metals gleaming under harsh lights, humiliation burning through his dignity. James finished a sentence Pierce couldn't bring himself to say, his heart sinking as he stood on the community hall steps. The carefully polished metals he'd pinned to his jacket for this moment now looked like ridiculous decorations amid the humiliation. 3 weeks of correspondence, 6 months of passionate letters about his military service, a suitcase full of hopes, and the promise of being honored at Riverbrook's Veterans Memorial Day, all crumbled in seconds when Frank Pierce finally laid eyes on him. "In your letters, you wrote so eloquently about your service. I imagined someone more." Pierce stammered, taking a step back, the program pamphlet wilting visibly in his sweaty hand. "Couldn't you have mentioned your age?" James took a deep breath, gathering every ounce of dignity he had left. "Tell you what exactly? That I'm 68, but my service and sacrifice were as real as anyone's? You never asked." Pierce looked around nervously, noticing curious glances from townspeople and event staff. In the small town of Riverbrook, a well-dressed older veteran being publicly rejected was creating an irresistible spectacle. "You have to understand my position. The community expectations, my business," Pierce muttered, taking another step back. "We need someone more relatable for our young veterans. I can arrange transportation back to where you came from. You seem educated. I'm sure you'll understand." James felt a chill run down his spine, not from sadness, but from controlled anger that simmered silently. In his letters, Pierce had written about the community's desire to honor veterans, especially those with distinguished service records. At no point did he mention an age preference. "I spent my savings to get here," James said, his voice steady despite his inner trembling. "I have nowhere to go back to." Pierce reached into his pocket and pulled out some crumpled bills. "This should cover a place to stay for a few days until you work things out." That's when a deep voice cut through the tense air like thunder on a clear day. "Is that your solution, Pierce? Throw money at the problem and hope it goes away, like you always do." A tall man appeared behind Pierce, his piercing eyes fixed on the merchant who now seemed to shrink in size. He was dressed in simple but visibly expensive clothes, the kind of simplicity that only the truly wealthy can afford. His suntanned face betrayed a life spent outdoors, but his posture exuded unquestionable authority. "This is none of your concern, Maxwell," Pierce replied, but his voice betrayed uncertainty. "It becomes my concern when I watch a man I've known for 15 years behave like a coward." The man named Maxwell turned to James, his gaze softening slightly. "Sir, allow me to introduce myself. Alexander Maxwell. I have a ranch just outside town." James nodded stiffly, suspicious from experience that kindness from strangers often came with hidden prices. "If I may be bold," Alexander continued, "I offer you lodging at my home until you decide your next move. We have guest rooms rarely used, and my housekeeper would welcome the company." Pierce visibly choked. "Maxwell, you can't be serious. What will people say?" Alexander smiled coldly. "The same people who do business with me every day? The same people whose livelihoods depend on my land? I'm curious to hear what they'd say." Pierce paled even more, understanding the implied message. Alexander Maxwell wasn't just a rancher. He was the rancher, owner of half the productive land in the region. The Maxwell estate was not just a ranch on the outskirts, as its owner had modestly described. It was a stately stone mansion surrounded by acres of thriving pastures where magnificent horses grazed peacefully. As Alexander's truck passed through ornate gates, James felt simultaneously impressed and wary. "People here aren't used to change," Alexander explained as he pointed to the main house. Riverbrook was founded by traditional families who remained conveniently stuck in the past. Frank Pierce is just a symptom of a deeper disease. The housekeeper, Mrs. Foster, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and impeccable posture, greeted James with professional courtesy. If she was surprised by the presence of an elderly veteran guest, she didn't show it. "I prepared the blue room, the one with the best view of the pastures," she said, leading James through hallways decorated with Western art and family photographs. At dinner that evening, served in the imposing dining room, Alexander explained his history. The son of a cattle baron and a schoolteacher who had embraced veterans' causes, he had inherited not only a fortune, but also strict principles about respect and dignity. When he moved to Riverbrook 15 years earlier, he had been regarded as eccentric, too rich to be ostracized, but too different to be completely accepted. "And what is your story, Mr. Wilson?" he finally asked after describing the businesses he ran. "Your letters must have impressed Pierce for him to extend an invitation to the ceremony." James hesitated, but something about Alexander's direct manner inspired confidence. "I was a captain in the Army, served 2 tours in Vietnam, later became a military history instructor at Fort Benning. When the Veterans Center where I volunteered closed due to funding cuts, I realized I needed to start over somewhere else." What James didn't mention was the real reason behind his correspondence. An unexpected discovery among his late commanding officer's effects, a man who had spent his final years researching historical injustices against veterans. This discovery included not only carefully preserved documents, but also ancient land grants that could change the fate of certain properties in the Riverbrook region. Documents he had hidden in a false bottom of his suitcase. In the days that followed, Alexander gave James something rare: space to think. The mansion's library was a treasure trove of knowledge, and James immersed himself in books on local history, geography, and regional regulations. When asked about his interests, he would simply smile and say he was refreshing old knowledge. A week after his arrival, news of his presence had spread throughout the small town. Visits to the Maxwell mansion suddenly increased. Curious neighbors, merchants, wives, even a local reverend, all suddenly remembering urgent matters to discuss with Alexander. "Just look at that," Alexander muttered during afternoon coffee after a particularly obvious delegation had left. "You become the local attraction without even setting foot in town." James smiled bitterly. "I've always been an attraction, Mr. Maxwell. The difference is that now I have fine china in my hand while I'm being watched." It was during one of these visits that Frank Pierce finally worked up the courage to show up. He arrived unannounced, hat in hand, his face a mask of false concern. "Maxwell," he greeted nervously, "I just came to see if Mr. Wilson is comfortable." "Absolutely delighted," Alexander replied dryly. "Why don't you ask him personally?" Pierce's face paled as James entered the room, wearing one of the tailored shirts Mrs. Foster had found for him. No longer the humiliated man from the ceremony, but a gentleman who moved with the confidence and purpose that decades of military service had instilled in him. "Mr. Pierce," he greeted coldly. What an unexpected surprise. Pierce fidgeted with his hat. "I came because the community is concerned. About my well-being? How kind. About your situation." Pierce glanced at Alexander. "It's not proper for an elderly man to remain indefinitely in another's residence, especially when there are questions about his background." "When the elderly man is a decorated veteran," Alexander finished, his voice dangerously soft. "Go on, Pierce. I'm curious how you intended to finish that sentence." Pierce swallowed hard. "The business committee is considering options to help him return to Atlanta. A collection is being organized." James smiled the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "How generous. But I'm afraid my plans have changed. I intend to remain in Riverbrook indefinitely." Pierce's eyes widened. "That's impossible. You don't know anyone here. You have no job, no family." "I have a job," James replied calmly. "Mr. Maxwell has kindly offered me the position of archivist on his estate. Apparently, generations of Maxwells have accumulated historical documents without properly organizing them." Pierce looked at Alexander with barely contained anger. "You can't be serious." Alexander shrugged. "I've never been more serious. Mr. Wilson is educated and competent. My archives have never been in better hands." What Pierce didn't realize as he stumbled through increasingly feeble protests was the true significance of that job. The Maxwell archives didn't just contain family records. They also housed land documents, legal papers, and a complete history of the region, including details many traditional families would prefer to remain buried. When Pierce finally left, defeated and furious, Alexander watched from the window as he hurried across the driveway. "He'll try to make your life difficult," he remarked. The humiliation you inflicted on his ego today won't be forgotten. James nodded, a new determination shining in his eyes. Let him try. While he's busy spreading rumors, I'll be digging much deeper than he ever imagined. What Frank Pierce couldn't know, what no one in Riverbrook could guess, was that the hours James spent in the library had a very specific purpose. Among yellow documents and dusty records, he was beginning to piece together a puzzle that would reveal an uncomfortable truth. Riverbrook's traditional founding families, including the Pierces, had built their fortunes on land that had been designated for returning veterans after conflicts dating back generations, land that had been systematically diverted through questionable means. And while the local society buzzed with gossip about the elderly veteran staying at the Maxwell Mansion, James was quietly setting the stage for a revelation that would shake the community to its core. 2 weeks later, Riverbrook's town hall was overflowing. An emergency meeting had brought together the founding families, local merchants, and ranchers from across the region. At the center of the commotion, Frank Pierce gestured wildly, his face red with indignation. It's an outrage. Maxwell is openly defying our traditions by keeping that old man on his property. Decent families are concerned about his intentions and influence. As murmurs of agreement rippled through the room, the doors swung open. Alexander Maxwell entered calmly, followed by James Wilson, who walked with a dignity befitting his years of service. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. "I appreciate the invitation," Alexander said, his voice firm, reaching every corner of the hall. "Although I must correct a misunderstanding. Mr. Wilson isn't here as my guest, but as a legal representative of a matter that deeply concerns all of you." Pierce laughed nervously. "Legal representative? An elderly veteran with no standing or authority. Maxwell, have you completely lost your mind?" James opened his briefcase methodically. "Actually, Mr. Pierce, in addition to being a certified military historian, I have legal power of attorney as the designated successor to Colonel William Harrison." The name struck like lightning in the silent hall. The older faces visibly tensed. "Colonel Harrison is dead," Pierce retorted quickly. He made wild claims that were never substantiated. "Curious," James replied, removing yellow documents from his briefcase, "because I have here the original land grant signed by the governor in 1866, establishing the Veteran Settlement Initiative, designating approximately 60% of what is now Riverbrook as land reserved for returning Union soldiers, including the property where your store stands, Mr. Pierce." Judge Thornton adjusted his glasses to examine the documents James now presented. This looks authentic. It's a forgery," Pierce shouted, but his voice trembled. "The supporting records are here," James continued unperturbed, "including account of how the Veteran Settlement Initiative was systematically undermined between 1870 and 1872, and how the founding families quietly formed what they called the Riverbrook Property Committee to redistrict the land." Alexander then spoke. "The Maxwell archives keep copies of all land records in the region. Curious how specific 1870 to 1872 sections were missing until Mr. Wilson found cross-references in other documents." Reverend Miller, an elderly man, bowed his head. "My grandfather mentioned this story. He said it was a sin buried deep. We're not here to punish descendants for the sins of their ancestors," James declared. "I'm proposing a solution. The creation of a Veterans Memorial Foundation that benefits all citizens of Riverbrook, especially focus on education for children and housing assistance for elderly veterans." Pierce laughed nervously. "That's absurd. No one will believe the charade." That was when Attorney Jefferson, a respected three-state lawyer, entered the hall. "The documents have been verified by the State Historical Commission. They are authentic, and I am pleased to inform you that a formal review has been initiated." The hall erupted in raised voices. Amid the confusion, Pierce lunged furiously toward James. "You planned this from the beginning," he hissed. "That's what you were hiding in your letters." James remained calm. "No, Mr. Pierce. In those letters, I was just a veteran seeking recognition. It was your immediate rejection of me when you saw my age that made me realize what kind of man you really were. The kind who would have rejected those returning soldiers for the same reason you rejected me. Because you deemed us too old, too broken, or too inconvenient." "You're going to ruin us," Pierce muttered, pale. No, James replied softly. I'm going to restore historical justice in the fairest way possible. The difference between us, Mr. Pierce, is that I've faced discrimination and dismissal my entire later life. Yet I don't wish anyone to lose their home, not even you. As Pierce collapsed into a chair, defeated, the city council withdrew to deliberate on James's proposal. Alexander approached him, admiration evident in his gaze. You could have demanded everything, he said softly, and made myself just like those who stole from the veterans who came before me. James replied, Justice isn't revenge, Alexander. It's restoration. What no one in that room could imagine as they watched the elderly veteran they had rejected and underestimated was that the true transformation of Riverbrook was just beginning. The message that would echo through generations would not be about a man who came to destroy, but about one who, even when wounded, chose to rebuild with dignity and vision. 6 months after that historic meeting, Riverbrook had been transformed. The Veterans Memorial Foundation, established with funds recovered from historical injustice, was already funding scholarships for disadvantaged youth and housing projects for elderly veterans. At the center of this transformation was James, not as a vengeful figure, but as a visionary who saw beyond the pain. Frank Pierce's former store now housed Riverbrook's first Veterans Affairs office, ironically a place where forgotten sacrifices could finally be honored. Pierce himself had left town weeks after the revelation, selling his properties for a fraction of their value and departing without goodbyes. Rumor had it he was working as a clerk in a neighboring town, his pride as diminished as his bank account. You could have destroyed him completely, Alexander remarked one fall afternoon as they strolled to the gardens of the estate, now partially converted into a veterans' cultural center. Most people would have demanded every last penny. James smiled, watching young cadets from a new military preparatory program playing on lawns that had once been exclusive territory of the elite. Revenge would have given me satisfaction for a day. This, he gestured to the space around them, will give us all satisfaction for generations. News of the Riverbrook veteran settlement case had spread beyond the small town, attracting journalists and historians interested in documenting similar cases of historical injustice against veterans. James received invitations to speak at universities, sharing not only his personal story, but the legal methodology he had used to reestablish the truth. During a celebratory dinner in the main hall of the Maxwell Mansion, now officially renamed the Veterans Maxwell Cultural Center, Judge Thornton raised his glass in an unexpected toast. To the man who taught us that honor is not just a military concept but a daily practice, he declared, his voice breaking with genuine emotion. When James arrived in our town, we thought we knew exactly who he was based solely on his appearance and age. What a humbling and necessary lesson we learned. In the old Central Square, where once only traditional founding families were celebrated, a new monument had been erected. Not a grand statue, but a simple bronze plaque telling the story of the Veteran Settlement Initiative and how land unjustly taken had finally returned to its purpose of serving the entire community. As evening fell over Riverbrook, James watched the city lights from his new porch at the Veterans Living History Center. He had arrived as a rejected stranger, an elderly veteran deemed too old to be honored. Now he was not only accepted but respected, not for bowing to the expectations of others, but for standing firm in his principles. When Alexander joined him with 2 cups of coffee, James reflected on the journey that had brought them there. You know what's ironic? He said. Frank rejected me because he couldn't imagine honoring someone who didn't fit his narrow image of a presentable veteran. In the end, that's exactly what destroyed him. While you thrived, Alexander added, because of exactly what he despised, your experience, your history, your wisdom. The lesson Riverbrook learned, and one that would echo for generations, was simple but profound. When we judge someone based on age or appearance, we not only deny their humanity, we blind ourselves to the extraordinary value they could bring to our lives. As James Wilson watched the sun set over the town that had once rejected him, he knew that true justice had never been about punishing Frank Pierce. It was about building something so meaningful and lasting that Pierce's rejection would become nothing more than a footnote in the much larger story being written. If the story of overcoming prejudice and achieving justice with dignity touched your heart, don't forget to comment, share, and subscribe. We all have a responsibility to respect our veterans, regardless of their age. What's your experience with honoring those who served? Share your thoughts in the comments below.